Hi, I'm Imogen. I'm the founder of Yoreflix, a streaming platform that specializes in historical and period drama. We've got a really exciting series on the platform right now called New Gold Mountain, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history behind that series. When we think of the gold rush, we probably think about North America, but on the other side of the world, there was an even bigger migration of people happening, possibly the biggest migration of people in the 19th century. So you had your English, your Irish, and your Americans who were all flooding to these gold fields, but you also had a much bigger movement of people from South China. At Yoreflix, we love historical time periods like this, historical time periods that don't necessarily get the big exposure that they deserve, but stories that are so intrinsic to the history of different countries around the world. So let's take it back. In 1851, gold was discovered in Victoria. For people in southern China, especially the province of Guangdong, this was really significant. They already had a name for the Californian gold rush, Gamsung, the Gold Mountain. So the news from Australia became known as Yun Gamsung, the new gold mountain. It was also a particularly tricky time to be living in southern China. The Qing dynasty was weakening. The region was kind of racked by rebellions. It was one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history. This, combined with famine, economic disruption from foreign trade, created this real push factor. Millions were desperate to just survive and find a way to provide for their families. So New Gold Mountain wasn't just about wealth, it was this lifeline. The journey itself was an ordeal. Men, mostly all men, would leave women and children behind and go to discover what opportunities there were in this new promised land. And when they arrived in Melbourne, they brought with them their social structures, and it was actually this organisation that probably was paramount to the survival of these subsections of Australian society. The Chinese camps themselves in the Victorian goldfields were absolute marvels of self-sufficiency. They had functioning communities, they had their own shops, restaurants, doctors, they practiced traditional medicine, they had opera troupes. For the men living there, it was kind of a taste of home in a very hostile land. On the goldfields themselves, they had a reputation for being very industrious. They would probably work in teams of like 30 to 100 people. Again, very different to the individualistic nature of the work that had existed so far. Obviously, to many European miners, the Chinese were kind of an unwelcome, strange economic threat. So their kind of sending of gold back to China was just seen as draining wealth from the colony. All these classic things that happened throughout history, and the friction soon grew into open hostility. The most famous incidents were the Buckland riot in 1857 and then the Lambing Flat riots in New South Wales, where armed mobs of European miners attacked Chinese camps, burning tents, stealing possessions, and brutally beating people up. They were pretty organised acts of racial violence, fueled by economic anxiety and inflammatory rhetoric from politicians and newspapers. The Chinese were depicted as heathens and servile and incapable of being part of a modern society. So there was way more than just a clash over gold. It was kind of the battle of the future of a nation's identity. So in 1855, the colony of Victoria passed an act to make provision for certain immigrants. The act imposed a heavy £10 tax on every Chinese person arriving by ship in the Victorian port. It also limited the number of Chinese passengers that a ship could carry. It was not just a tax, it was like a limitation on paper. But these settlers were resourceful, so the headmen and the organisers found a loophole. Because the law only applied to ships going into Victoria, they began redirecting their ships to different ports. And then newly arrived men would basically endure this trek across Australia through the bush to reach the goldfields. This actually was the start of what would become the much more infamous White Australia policy, literally what it was called. And this was designed to create an entirely British nation from the Australian colonies. When the Australian colonies federated into a single nation in 1901, one of the first acts of the new federal parliament was the passing of this policy. And to justify this policy, a new kind of national myth was necessary. So the story of Australia had to be the story of brave, hardworking, specifically white pioneers. And, the rhetoric of the southern Chinese workforce didn't fit with that. And look, the process of selective memory is not unique to Australia or to this time period. It happens throughout time, and that's why I studied history. It's why I'm so passionate about finding new ways for people to learn about history and engage with the past. I think it's one of the reasons that historical drama can be really powerful, especially if you're using it to shed light on these kinds of time periods. And there are so many other stories that are brushed aside. They're often messy, they're often hard to talk about. People don't really know what the right thing to say is, but it's why it's so important that we keep these dialogues about history open. The good news is history, even when it's buried, has a reputation for resurfacing. So archaeologists have undertaken painstaking excavation work in Australia now and found the material culture of the Chinese camps, porcelain coins, personal items that tell a rich story of everyday life. They read old newspapers, government documents, found the voices that were silenced. And this historical drama that we have on Yoreflix, New Gold Mountain, tells that story in a way that I think you will love. I love it. I think it's a great watch. And I hope this explains a little bit about the history and about why I think this story is really worth showcasing to a wide audience as well.